So I am excited to introduce our next speaker. Karime Mesouto is a physiotherapist and a PhD candidate from the University of Queensland, Australia. In her doctoral research, Karime is interested in enhancing low back pain healthcare delivery by critically looking at the biopsychosocial model of health. She is particularly interested in exploring the socio-cultural and political dimensions of healthcare practices. Her research uses a variety of critical qualitative methodologies and collaborates with clinicians and people with lived experiences of low back pain. Before commencing her PhD studies, Karime worked clinically for 7 years and was a lecturer in physiotherapy undergraduate programs in Brazil. She holds a master's degree in rehabilitation science and a graduate certificate in clinical musculoskeletal physiotherapy. She is a passionate physiotherapist aspiring to contribute to best practice care for people with musculoskeletal pain conditions. So welcome, Karime.
So hi, everyone. First of all, thanks, Rajam, for inviting me to this fantastic summit. The discussions have been amazing, and it's really hard to follow the amazing Dr. Jessica Isom. So I'll do my best here to, just contribute to, this discussion that has been going on about power, either implicitly or explicitly. So that's a common practice at the University of Queensland and usually in Australia, to just start with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet in San Diego. So I Google it, and I hope I have the right groups and I won't pronounce it, because otherwise I will be making like a terrible pronunciation. But I would like to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And I would like to pay my respects to where my research was conducted in Meanjin, Brisbane, in Australia, where the Turrbal and Yagara people has their country there. So, and extend my respects to any Indigenous and First Nations peoples here today. Okay, so perhaps start from the end. So one of the things, the key message that I would really like us, to discuss, or perhaps take a little bit from this presentation, is that power is actually everywhere, right? And it's pretty much relational, and I'll go through that a little bit more during the presentation. And when we think about power, it's not about leaving all the decisions in the clinician's hands or the patient's hands, right? We're, of course, fostering this collaboration and this how structures actually influence as well and the way we collaborate or the way that we interact with patients. But of course, we really need to acknowledge that those in a position of power, we are responsible for reflecting on our privilege and making care more collaborative. And power it's quite fluid and it is complex. Not everyone has, it's entirely privileged or entirely marginalized, but especially those in a position of power, that's our work to make care more collaborative for patients and also colleagues. So talking about power requires us to be brave and vulnerable, and we talk a lot about safe spaces, but I think with safety, also when we don't feel uncomfortable, when we don't feel discomfort, then there's a problem in that. So so I just would like us to invite to be and continue this conversation of being brave, being vulnerable. It can be and it is uncomfortable. So the amazing conversations that we had yesterday on Disrupt OT, PT After Dark, and has been, from Dr. Jessica Isom as well. So it is uncomfortable, but should not lead to inaction, right? We should sit with the discomfort, but also act on that as well. So why is thinking about power in the context of pain management important? So we all want, as I'm assuming, to make sure healthcare benefits all, right? And not just some people. And we know that, historically and socially, some people and some groups receive better care than others. But we really want to make sure healthcare benefits all. And we really need to acknowledge how power plays out in this will. So power is everywhere, and when we talk about patient-centered care, which is the cornerstone for best care, and that incorporates each individual's context, knowledge, needs, values, goals, and preferences into this shared decision-making about pain management. And when we talk about shared decision-making, it has to be a conversation, right? An exchange of expertise to create together, and I really love this quote from Joleta and colleagues, a narrative that makes sense of things in ways that are mutually acceptable, right? So when we talk about shared decision-making, when we talk about having a conversation, an exchange of expertise together, and in ways that are mutually acceptable, we're talking about negotiating power and thinking about power, which is interesting because it's not usually explicitly said, usually in the pain literature. So let's talk about power and think about power as a central component of this so-called patient-centered care. And just a disclosure, my PhD actually sits, between two worlds. I'm a physio. I've been socialized as a physio, and there's a lot of power in there as well. But during my PhD, I was introduced to this more sociological way of thinking. So I use sociological concepts, philosophical concepts as well, to think about low back pain care or pain management in a different way. So what do I mean by power, right? And there's this classical way sometimes of thinking about power, like political or sociological power, a very classical way that is very explicit, sometimes very coercive. So when we think about, police or the structures that are involved, police, law, that is very explicit. But the way that I'm going to perhaps discuss a little bit more is this more interpersonal power, right? This power that is more implicit, that is more subtle, that is relational, and I'll talk a little bit more about that is fluid. And as Foucault mentioned, is located in action rather than position. And position, of course, interferes, but hopefully through this different lens that is implicit, is subtle, we can disrupt certain power relations as well. Because power is everywhere, right? And I'll give some examples about that. Power is relational, which means that it does not belong to one person usually, but exists in the relationships between people and groups of people. But we really need to acknowledge that certain group of people have more power than others. Sometimes can be organized within corporations or unions, and sometimes not. And it is also context is specific, right? In that people can have a lot of power in certain situations, but they can be powerless in others. But we really need to acknowledge that socially and historically, some groups of people have more power than others. So, and thinking about power makes us think about privilege, right? And I'm not going to go into much detail about the inequities that exist, right? Because thinking about power is desiring, to make sure healthcare benefits all, but there are inequities. And as other speakers have mentioned, as healthcare professionals, we are part of the problem as well, and then we can be part of the solution, right? And I feel really privileged to be in this amazing summit because I think there are a lot of discussions of, being part of the solution as well. And bravely acknowledging our role in all those inequities. So to me, thinking about power is really looking at the mirror, having this, recognize how my experiences, how my characteristics, how my identities or constructs that I identify with interferes in the way that I see the world, how I'm socialized to think, to act and how that intentionally and unintentionally lead to how I treat others and how I treat my patients and colleagues. So this kind of reflexivity, this kind of personal reflexivity, which is influenced by institutional aspects and systems, a reflexive healthcare professional really examines their own beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions, right? Because we make a lot of assumptions about people that shape our practice, right? And unless we acknowledge those assumptions and we really attune to that, we can't improve, and that's what we want to do. So a critically reflexive practitioner examines how power relations and consider how ideological perspectives shape our practice and the practice context in which they work. So I'm going to be a little bit brave, a little bit vulnerable here, and disclose some of the constructs, identities that I identify with that give me more power in certain contexts and less power in others. So I'm a PhD candidate in Australia. I'm here, in this stage, talking to you. I'm a physio, I'm a cisgender, able-bodied, thin, heterosexual. I had a Christian upbringing. I'm Brazilian. I'm culturally and linguistically diverse migrant in Australia from the global south, which can be different from a culturally and linguistically diverse person from the global north. I'm a woman. I wasn't middle class in Brazil, non-indigenous, white, etc. And this is not an extensive list. The cultures that I identify with, the groups that I work with and I hang out with makes who I am, which means that I have assumptions, that I have blind spots, and I really need to recognize that so I can, decrease those assumptions. So just an example from putting this critical reflexivity and this type of reflexivity into action is that being a Brazilian living in Australia with a Christian upbringing make me have some assumptions, right? So I grew up in the physiotherapy profession as a physiotherapist. I have this very Western scientific medical understandings of the body, right? Having a Christian upbringing, I have a focus on particular faith-based understandings of well-being. And I have blind spots, right? Perhaps with people's cultures, ways of understanding health, the body, pain, or the religions, multiple religions, or non-religions, understandings of well-being. But because I have those assumptions, because power, is relational and interferes these assumptions in how I relate to people, there are ways that I can reduce such assumptions, right? Noticing when assumptions are made, reflecting on that, being more collaborative with patients, with my colleagues, because I have certain assumptions and blind spots, and educating myself. Because, from dominant groups, educating myself and not letting others educate me, that's one of the most important things as well as a dominant group. So this type of reflexivity prompts interrogation of issues such as power, right? Within those characteristics and constructs, autonomy, beliefs, values, language, and systematic structures that are embedded in the way we act and think, but acknowledging that and challenging that allows space to act and think differently. So it is actually challenging those assumptions are acts of resistance, right? Of going against it, of these power relations, and challenging these dominant discourses. And one of the things that I did in my PhD was actually resisting or challenging, looking at the assumptions embedded in this biopsychosocial model, right? And reflecting on our common practice that sometimes we say things or we act things, but within those assumptions is actually something totally different. So this was actually my first PhD article where, I critically look at the biopsychosocial model of low back pain care in physiotherapy. And what is interestingly is that, when we discuss power and power dynamics, we are already thinking beyond the biopsychosocial model. Because within the biopsychosocial model, it's actually, there's no discussions about systemic structures and power relations and cultural dimensions, so and. So, and that's what I've noticed in this research, is that when researchers mentioned that they were doing, and we analyzed 66 articles in that sense, when they said they were using the biopsychosocial model or having a biopsychosocial approach, they were actually focused on standard psychological assessment forms and biological measurements. So the biopsychosocial was biopsycho, right? And it was also pretty focused on changing patients' and physiotherapists' attitudes and beliefs. Again, going back to this more cognition, psychological way of thinking. And when they referred to, the social aspect of the biopsychosocial, was limited to work, family, and relationships. So there was perhaps very little or even none considerations of broader aspects of care, such as, socioeconomic and political circumstances, cultural and social determinants of health, power dynamics. And it was very, very individualized without this conversation, this fluidity of how we work. It was quite apolitical and historical as well. So how can we better, when we're thinking, so we're already thinking and reflecting beyond the biopsychosocial model, when we think about, these aspects and these broader constructs, so how can we better consider power within clinical interactions? So I'm just going to give 3 examples from the research from my PhD that was embedded in this fantastic project led by the amazing Dr. Jenny Setchell. They were my primary supervisor and mentor. I also had Associate Professor Rebecca also and Professor Paul Hodges as secondary supervisors, and all these amazing people that were part of this great project. And the examples that I'm going to share here is, although I can say it is embedded in my PhD, but it was a collaborative effort, right? Discussions and constructs as well. So this was funded by NHMRC, Arthritis Australia, and the University of Queensland. And I'm not going to get into much details about the methodology. It was all qualitative, so I'm sorry about number lovers out there, statistics, no, not going to happen. So what we did, we actually observed clinical practices, right? Real life clinical practice, which we call ethnographic observations. And these were essentially researchers coming into two clinics, public multidisciplinary pain clinic and a private physiotherapy clinic. We would take notes of the physical space, what was going on in interactions. We would sit in consultation rooms, in team meetings, and also observing how people interact with each other and taking notes. So we were not interested in which treatment works best or if the people were doing what they were doing in terms of in technical ways, but the interaction, how's their interaction was going. We also had dialogues with clinicians from these two clinics, so we would share some findings with them and having these discussions and these deeper discussions that going beyond the biopsychosocial model. Let's discuss more about the social cultural aspects of what you're doing. We also discussed those findings in a research team, and our research team had clinicians that wanted to participate from the clinics as well. So we call it a research team, but we had clinicians. We also invited people with low back pain to participate, but we also collaborated with people with lived experience of low back pain or advisors, and we would share our the findings and have their expertise incorporated into what we were saying. We had these collaborative discussions of how does this make sense, so we had this highly collaborative, research and this amazing project, but we tried to take all these different perspectives into consideration. So the first example in how power played out, right? So having this power lens in here to discuss is how played out in exercise prescription. And perhaps you don't prescribe exercise, but I really want to think, how do you talk about exercise, or how do you talk about all the seemingly mundane or benign activities? Because we know, and we've had excellent presentations that says, and we know that exercises are commonly prescribed for people with pain and are usually presented as a great choice for self-management, and patients are expected to be empowered, and exercise is one way to empower them to choose, right, and often carry out their own management by engaging with exercise, for example. But when we think about power and how, exercise prescription is a practice that is influenced by social, cultural, and political dimensions of health, it makes us think or rethink or critically reflect in how we are doing what we are doing, right? Because there is a vast literature that actually pushes back a little bit. It's not that exercise is not great and is not, a great way for people to decrease their pain, but exercise can be seen as something that everyone can do, and it actually reinforces normative assumptions about human bodies, right? That, okay, you just need to exercise. But we really need to question who gets to do the exercise. Do they have the time, resources, bodily capabilities to engage with exercise? Because when we think how our past experience with exercise builds up on how we present or how we talk about exercise, that is how power plays out in that relationality as well. Because, we notice in our research, and I did that all the time, there was this constantly asking, how did your exercise go? What do you think about your exercise? Oh, you need to do your exercise. And it's very well-meaning, right? But I thought it was amazing where someone, had a question, I think, in the first presentation from Dr. Kathleen Sluka. What about shame and guilt that unintentionally we kind of place on people for perhaps not doing their exercises or of not doing certain things that we say that is best practice, right? And this shame and guilt has consequences on healthcare because people can, avoid healthcare altogether, right? And it was interesting, one of the receptionists, because a receptionist was also part of this clinician dialogue, and she said, actually, when we were discussing about exercise prescription, actually, I had just a patient calling yesterday saying, I haven't done my exercise. Can you cancel my consultation with the physio? So, and that was a private practice, right? Can you imagine in a public environment where people just don't say anything, they just don't go. They feel so ashamed, right? So how can we make that space or that practice safe, comfortable, that's okay, but how can we make make exercise prescription more collaborative? And this physio, I loved this, and she said during the dialogues, when I'm setting exercise, I ask, how many do you think you could do? Or how many times a week do you think you could realistically do this? So rather than telling them, this is how many I want you to do, what do you think you can do? What's realistic for you in your life? Because then maybe we get more of an idea of who that person is, right? We open up to actually know people for who they are. How are their neighborhoods? Is it safe to go out and exercise? Like, I think Deborah had mentioned that, and was really, really interesting because, who gets to do exercise, right? And also, we really make sure need to make sure that people feel comfortable and safe. And here I'm thinking more about emotionally safe when exercising. Because we had this great interaction, and I also did a lot of that, because squats, right? It's a common exercise for strength. And the observers noted that the patient said, when the physio asked, to squat, I hate squats. The patient said, they both laughed. I look at people doing it, and I feel awkward about it. The patient confessed and looked a bit uncomfortable. The physio then asked her to exit the treatment room to the open gym area and to do a squat in front of the mirror. Because sometimes when it's so common practice that we don't think, and I'm guilty of that as well, of how a squat feels, right? How doing an exercise feels. Maybe, this embodied experience of doing exercises, and there's power in there, how people, perhaps there's a trauma, there's, shame of doing certain types of exercise or exposing their bodies in certain ways. And we had this amazing patient advisor, and she was a bigger body woman, and she said, I feel really uncomfortable of going into this open gym area where you have this thin, athletic physios with thin, athletic patients, and I have to expose my body in certain ways. I just wished, physios or healthcare professionals would ask me, are you comfortable in going to that spaces, instead of assuming, right? So treating exercise as a choice or as a common practice that everyone can do, we really need to reflect that not everyone has the tools and social circumstances to be able to choose, right? Individuals from historically and culturally marginalized groups can be further marginalized with this sense of and expectations of being an active patient, of doing things of an empowered patient, and choose their own treatments, right? So we really need to support on that. So I really want to bring this, just for us to think, what are other similarly benign practices within your interaction with patients that might be seen differently through this, power relation, through this fluid power sharing, that can be more collaborative, that you can really, have those conversations and ask questions. So I'll leave to that. And for the second example, I would like us to think about how power operates within the clinical physical space, right? That was another thing that we've noticed, right? Let's just make an imagination exercise. So I really would like you to imagine a clinical room, perhaps your own or perhaps one that you've been to. What colors are the walls of this clinical room? Do you have, posters, pictures on the walls? What information is there on those walls? If there are people on those posters, do you feel represented? Do you feel that the clientele or the patients that you see are represented in that space? So let's turn to the furniture, right? How the furniture is arranged. Does the space have chairs, different sizes of chairs? How the chairs are actually placed in the room? Does the space accommodate different body sizes and different mobility aids? Can people circulate equally through that space? And finally, I just would like you to imagine a clinician and a patient in that space. Where are they sitting? Is there a table in front of them, separating them? Are they close to each other? Do you have a computer or a form that may be, receiving more attention than the person in front of you, right? So all of those things, power is playing out in how the furniture and how the clinical space is presented, right? And we've noticed through our research there are normative assumptions within those spaces. And influences the role, right, that plays out within that interaction with clinicians and patients and the staff as well. So for example, we've noticed how pictures on the walls from these clinics were usually, focused on anatomical structures, trigger points, transverse activation, and that says something about perhaps what we decide to focus on within our clinic. And the physical environment, matters to power dynamics, right? By signaling who is included or excluded in the room, for example. So we've noticed that the pictures on the walls are often of white, thin, heteronormative-looking people, wealthy people. So perhaps, having pictures of more diverse people, culturally diverse artwork, and flags of social movements, such as the LGBTQI plus Ally Pride flag, can help, and that's just, it can be tokenistic, right? So we really need to, if we're putting that on our walls, we really need to make sure that we are acknowledging those assumptions that we are making, and that making that space really truly safe, right, and diverse. And perhaps having a broader range of patients feel more welcome in that space, right, through that environment. And the use of a computer in a form is really interesting because it kind of sets a scene, and that can be quite, I need to, type things, I need to type the information. But then when you have a checklist, right, it signals who has the power in that interaction, and what agenda is going to be followed. And I'm not saying that we really need to get rid of that, but how to make that more collaborative, how to, instead of a preset agenda, we have certain ideas that we want to go through, but within that interactions, we make that more collaborative, and we make sure that there is an equal, a shared agenda making, a shared decision making. Okay, so small changes to the physical environment may seem very, minor, and can be, may affect, power dynamics by signaling who and whose contributions are valued. So again, I place that question to you. What changes can you make to your clinical environment, without being tokenistic, to ensure everyone feels valued, that everyone belongs? And finally, the third and final example of how power played out in our research was actually through the workplace culture, right? And I know some of you may work alone, but again, if that's the case, I would like you to just reflect or to challenge certain assumptions or how you can make things different within that culture, within your private practice as well. So again, that aligns well with Dr. Jessica Isom talk, where, and I align with others as well, that a collaborative workplace culture in health services is paramount for building a culture of equity, because when we're speaking about power, we're speaking about making sure healthcare benefits all, and it is equitable. So, and these discussions of power and critical reflexivity and assumptions we had with clinicians throughout our project, right? And towards the end, there was this amazing, this person in a leadership position, he shared that there isn't really a formal mechanism in the department beyond your study that I can think of, at least, where we can actually sit back and have a conversation around systems issues. Lots and lots of time to talk about individual patient care, what technique is better, etc., but nothing really to reflect on. Team meetings we have, and this was in a public multidisciplinary paying service, are so rigid within the agenda that there isn't really any opportunity for us to go off the deep end on something. So how can we make sure that these conversations, even, that we are having here, we actually put that in our workplaces, and we continue to have those conversations, as well as, in a journal club, what we say, this medication or this exercise prescription, and we have that conversations, that we also have conversations about systems issues. And also making sure that we have a collaborative workplace culture, right, and as Dr. Natalia Costa mentioned yesterday, is about sitting with uncertainty and vulnerability when we talk about pain management, right? And again, this was someone in a leadership position that shared with us that one of the things that we've been building on is this idea of complex case discussions. And with that, I think comes the acknowledgement, even for the senior staff, that often we don't really know what to do. That was really brave. And to normalize that, so that particularly the junior staff, when they see that, they presumably feel less distressed by not knowing what to do either. So this person has power, right? And he was a physician. So normalizing that for others, it's really important, right? Where clinicians quite openly acknowledge that they really don't know what to do from here, and that's okay, but without actually not leading to inaction, right? We don't know what to do, but we really need to know what to do from there, collaboratively, right, together. But making, acknowledging this vulnerability of, okay, I don't, all these complexities, all these, aspects are interfering in my patient's presentation. What can we do to help them, right, or to support? So how can you improve your workplace culture so that it can be attentive to power, privilege, and foster a culture of equity, right? Because that's what I think was really, really interesting about these conversations so far. How can we bring that to our place? And I always think about that myself as well, and foster this culture of equity within our workplace. So I also had, we had those outputs of articles, and yes, please feel free to email me if you want some of the articles that we published. But we also had some very fun and creative research outputs. As Deborah mentioned yesterday, I was really happy to see, the importance of joy, the importance of creativity within what we do, right? And academia can be quite boring. So, and I'm really, grateful for Dr. Jenny Satchel, because they brought a lot of creativity. They were an ex-acrobat, and they brought a lot of creativity into the research that they do. And this was an interesting, won't have time to go through this video, but we collaborated with artists as well to talk about power in the clinic. And some of the things that I shared here today are in this video, but the way that we present is, dragons with dragon scale pain, and yeah, just a different way of presenting what I just said here. So it's an 8-minute one, and was actually published in the Journal of Humanities and Rehab. We also had other research outputs. So we, again, all the findings from the private physiotherapy clinic is presented in this poster, and we have discussions about reducing power differences, right? So actively reducing power difference, do diversity training. So these were things that clinicians and people with lived experience of low back pain shared with us and the research team. So this poster is a collaboration, and it's free to download on Physiopedia. It can't be perhaps translated into every context, but it can start some conversations. Use collaborative communication, open questions, remain curious, ethically curious. Use inclusivity cues, artwork, flags, invite patient suggestions during treatment, feedback boxes, during system changes. Avoid labeling. People, language matters. So yeah, there are a lot of our patient advisors really mention how, and that plays out in the literature as well, how language matter and how we talk to people and how we refer to people with pain. And enhance the physical environment, human touches, show care as well. And we also had this, this audio, this 15-minute, and was myself, Dr. Jenny Satchel, Associate Professor Rebecca Olson, and Dr. Megan Weir, one of the patient advisors. And we talk about power in healthcare in almost like a podcast kind of way, where we had these discussions that I'm also presenting here, but in a different way, with different voices. So yeah, I think I'm pretty much on time, which I'm surprised. Okay, who's that? So I hope I could, share a little bit and contribute a little with this amazing discussion that has already been happening here and yesterday. How fluid power sharing arrangement, that's the type of power that I'm talking about, right? Where power is negotiated and renegotiated when we actually reflect on our own assumptions and how that affects the way we treat people and the way we talk to people, and how can we actually disrupt that, right? And renegotiate it, because it's not fixed. And just a reminder, there is never an absence of power from any social relationship, given the ubiquitous, capillary, and constitutive nature of power relations, being that personal, institutional, and how that interplays within our connections with patients and each other as well. So I hope throughout these examples, these very brief examples, we have much more, how power is actually everywhere and is relational and is present, within a very mundane, simple acts as exercise prescription, as our clinical physical environment, in our workplace culture. And power is not about leaving all the decisions in the clinicians' or patients' hands. It is a collaboration, and it is supposed to be fluid. But again, those in a position of power, we are responsible for reflecting on our own privilege and making care more collaborative. So thank you. And if there's any questions?
And yes, your timing is perfect. I was surprised. All right, any questions from the group? Anything online? Okay, great. And yeah, and if you could take your mask off as well, makes it way easier here.
Yeah, sure. This question is from Katie. What suggestions do you have to help train students and novice clinicians to shift the power dynamic within clinical interviews of patients? Often, the learning development stages force less experienced clinicians to inadvertently demonstrate behaviors that feed into a power imbalance.
That's an interesting. Can you just repeat that again, the first?
Yeah, sure. What suggestions do you have to help train students to shift the power dynamic within clinical interviews of patients? Often, the learning development stages force less experienced clinicians to inadvertently demonstrate behaviors that feed into a power imbalance.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm interpreting the question wrong, but yeah, I've heard sometimes that, very, like junior staff can also, reinforce those power dynamics, right? And it is a gap in our education, in the way that we think about power, because sometimes we need to have all the answers as healthcare professionals, right? And we perpetuate that, right? We don't perpetuate this culture of uncertainty, of collaboration, so the way that we saw in our research is actually starting those conversations, right? And really starting these conversations from people who have power, but also especially, right? So starting that and embedding that within our education, our clinics, our ways of talking, it helps to kind of really reflect on how we are doing or reinforcing, and perhaps I'm reinforcing in many, many ways. So we really need to continuously think about that. Perhaps is, making sure that throughout our clinical placement, we discuss about power. We discuss about racism. We discuss about systemic structures that influence the way that we talk about people and we talk with each other as well. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Obrigado, Karime, for your presentation. And so just to answer that question, I just wanted to share clinically how I do it, and I don't know if that's going to be helpful or not, but when I talk to a patient, I say, who's the expert in your body, of your body? And they're like, well, I am. I said, well, you're the expert in your body, and I am the so-called expert in pain and movement, but we are in a 50% partnership. So whatever we do together is going to be the outcome. So if you do a certain movement and that doesn't work for you, then it's not my fault. It's our fault that we didn't pick the right movement. So it's putting the choice in that space, that sacred space that we're sharing with each other. And I thought, I don't know, it's worked really well for me. But of course, what works for me doesn't mean that that's what the research says, whether this is just a clinical comment. Another thing I find that when I'm working with them in that assessment, I let them choose what we did today. What are the movements we did today can help you pick your grandchild from the floor? Which ones do you think would be helpful, instead of me telling them these are the exercise? And I'm going to move into another rant. I think our profession needs to move away from exercise. We're using that word way too much. I mean, that's what we've heard all day yesterday and a lot today. We need to move into meaningful movement, because that's what it is. It's the human that's sitting in front of us. And I'm just going to say one more thing, and thank you for the space idea, because I think I've already got multiple ideas that I can take some amazing photography of the local heroes from our community and putting a little story of them in our clinic space. So thank you. I know it wasn't a question, but I had to go on that.
And that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's the thing, isn't it? I happen to be here speaking about my research, but there are so many, amazing clinicians doing amazing things every day, right? So thank you so much for all the amazing work you've been doing. And definitely, it's not just, it's, amazing things. So thank you.
Thank you for the content and for the authenticity that you brought to the content. You mentioned that you had the input of lived experiences with patients with low back pain. Did they perceive some of these things or discuss them in your research? And did that co-register with some of the things or not that the senior leadership was saying in the quotes you presented?
Yeah, Thank you. And that's a great question. And definitely, I think from that experience, so before my PhD, which is entirely qualitative and has this collaborative aspect, I've never thought about qualitative research and never heard about integrating patients' voices into and collaborating with patients within research. And I can see research being done in another way from here now. And definitely the examples that I brought, there were a lot of discussions, and because of the 45 minutes, I couldn't elaborate on that. But every example that was there, it was influenced by something that a patient said or something that a clinician said. And because we tend to think about research in a very objective way, right? Okay, no, looking at the data very objectively. But the beautiful thing about qualitative and the type of qualitative that I do is that things affect me. And because it affects me, I choose to bring it to, a paper or a presentation, and it is really hard to separate, okay, this was what a patient said or this was a clinician said, but definitely the patient's voice are there. And the guilt and shame of doing exercises were also because one of the patient advisors mentioned how she felt guilty of not doing the exercise, So yeah, it is incorporated. We have patients as co-authors as well in our papers. But yeah, it's very ingrained and it's not perfect. Like, for example, patients did not develop the research questions on that. They were not leading certain aspects of the research because of the way that the project was designed. But definitely, we have the patient's voices on those examples and quotes as well that I decide to share. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Come on up. And then, are you going to ask the online question, or is it you? Okay. So go ahead and ask your question, then we'll do the online.
Hi. As someone in the Australian healthcare system, love your work and really appreciate it. As an exercise physiologist, I agree. It's in our title. I have to kind of debunk it a lot of times with patients, so thank you for this discussion. I'm curious, in private practice where there are business models that incentivize patient retention, and for employees, myself having an experience in a private practice where I'm incentivized to retain a patient, and how that might impact the power dynamic that is often unsaid when it comes to rebooking. I'm doing all these quotation marks to give some emphasis. I'm very interested in learning your advice that you would give to employees in that position, mindful of the context of whether there's privacy to even have these discussions with patients if there's employees are financially incentivized to fill in their books and not maybe have the patient's well-being and best interests in this shared decision-making space. Very complicated question, so happy to.
No, but that is great, because one of the things that we've noticed was this, hugely, this difference between the fee-for-service model and the public model. Like, even in time, right, the private practice was much more rushed in that context, right, than the public one. We had more time. And the patient retention, we didn't touch on that, but definitely through the conversations of, is every patient that comes into this door able to pay for physiotherapy services, because that was the private physiotherapy practice. And one of the clinicians mentioned, I never had that conversation with my patients. I never actually asked them, are you able to pay for the next one? I just said, our next consultation is in next week, right? And then she reflected and she was like, maybe that's why some young, that patient actually just disappeared. So you never know, of course. And that perhaps requires us to change the culture of the space. Okay, there are retentions, there are things to consider, and I don't know if I have the right question, but if we kind of have that conversation, right? The things that we value. What do we value in that space? Perhaps we can find different ways. Some patients will happily pay and will have the resources to pay forever, others not. How can we make that balance, right? And I'm sure the fantastic speaker, Ryan, yesterday, he can even give much more examples, but thank you, that's a great question.
Okay, can we have the online question, please?
This question is from AJ. Do you have thoughts on how power dynamics, as well as patients' marginalized identities and past experiences with healthcare, influence how interventions like pain science education, CBT, ACT, mindfulness, and exercise are offered by clinicians, as well as received or perceived by patients?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
Yeah. Do you have thoughts on how power dynamics, as well as patients' marginalized identities and past experiences with healthcare, influence how interventions like pain science education, CBT, ACT, mindfulness, or exercise are offered by clinicians, as well as received or perceived by patients?
Oh, yeah. So it's not within my area, but yeah, there has been some literature on how this is the same as exercise. It works for some people, but not for all. Pain neuroscience education works for some people, but not for all. And for who that works to, it speaks loudly within inequalities. Who gets to understand that? And is this appropriate? Because it's a very Western way of talking about pain. It's a very top-down approach of clinician thinking. So, yeah, how can we make that more collaborative? And that's appropriate for that context, for that patient in that sense. I don't think, I have the right answer for that, because it really needs, when we think about power, is usually clinicians telling patients what to do and what to feel and how to act. And yeah, disrupting that to, does that make sense? If not, let's leave it, and having that conversation, and the patient as an expert in their pain, they already have certain ideas that we can build on as well. It's not always, one direction, so yeah. We need to be careful with those techniques.
Thank you. And then you said you have a quick comment, and then we'll close this
Not
session.
such a quick comment, so we can talk.
Okay. All right. Remove your mask.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I truly appreciate the presentation. Obrigado. So I actually, a couple of things, and even just as that person was asking that online question, something just came up to my mind, and I truly do agree with you, like the different treatment approaches, whether it's psychological, social, or like physical modalities or active interventions we use, work for a subpopulation. It doesn't work for everyone, and really it's providing that kind of personalized care, and when it's not within our realm of influence or competence, like in providing specific treatment, but we feel that with our knowledge that they may benefit from ACT treatment, then it may be appropriate to refer them to a pain psychologist or whoever is able to provide that treatment to them. But not saying, okay, I provide this exercise or whatever to the person, and the person is not improving, so that's a failure on me, or like they are not doing it properly, so that's why they're not improving. Then kind of reinforcing that power imbalance is like, well, you're not getting better because you're not doing the things I told you to do. And so I really do appreciate also moving away from the term exercise, because as an OT, I really do find that troublesome. Like we call it, whether you guys want to call it like meaningful movements, we call it meaningful occupations. It's whatever you do during the day, from the time you get up to the time you go to sleep. It's, it is about sex, it's about sleep, it's about everything you do during the day is an exercise. So a lot of my treatment may simply be that you have a shoulder injury and you're afraid of using your entire right limb. Recently, I have a firefighter that had a car accident, and they're so guarding their right shoulder, they don't want to do anything about it. I'm like, well, there's no reason why you can't use your elbow, you can't use your hand. Like, we can still allow you to do some of this task, and I also threw in a bit of the neural education in there. It's kind of getting them to be more comfortable with moving that arm, because actually there's no limitations that provided by the physician or the surgeon saying they can't move it. It's just them feeling the pain that's limiting them from doing it. But I just feel like it's very important to have this conversation. So really thank you for your research. Just one last thing is, in your research, do you look into universal designs? Because it sounds like you are throwing in the concept of that and understanding, when folks come into our clinics or wherever setting we're seeing them, they may come in different shape and size. And if we're all having the same size of chairs, that's not always accommodating, but how do we kind of make that into part of the clinic design from the get-go, or the hospital, or whichever setting you're working in, so they don't feel like they're being singled out. Like the design is incorporated into the environment, so it's homogenized. But yeah, it sounds like you were talking some of the concept, but I wasn't sure if that's something you looked into.
Yeah, so thank you. I'll lead to the question. So you mentioned the concept. Can you just...
Universal design.
Yeah, so we didn't go into that much. With the different sizes of chairs, we actually noticed in the clinic, right? And that was an interesting aspect because we haven't seen it in other clinics, right? And yes, it is complex, and perhaps having this feedback, right? What patients think about it, or how they perceive the environment can be something that can be incorporated to make sure that, yeah, it's not singled out. And yeah, we make sure that the environment is set, for clinicians and patients. Yeah, but we didn't go into that much detail, but yeah, thank you. And the first part, so yeah, OTs, yeah, but at least in Australia, they have social theory embedded. I don't know if that's...
It's the same for us, yeah.
Yeah, and that's fantastic, right? So it's really interesting how different disciplines and different professions, they see the world so differently, and I wish we had more of that collaboration, that interdisciplinary collaboration, instead of a siloed multidisciplinary collaboration as well, because we can really learn from each other. Even the changing from exercise to movement, that makes a huge difference.
Because again, yes, words has powers. It has a lot of powers. And I do like your critical reflexibility approach, because a lot of my training in school was like, we really emphasize on that as well, like teaching and understanding the words you use. Disability is a word we actually try to avoid using, like when we're interacting with patients, because it makes them feel that they're not able to do things.
Yeah,
and it fits into that ableism.
Yeah, but it's very interesting as well, because I had someone saying, I'm a disabled person, and I identify as disabled. So even language is very difficult, right? So yeah, we can't, but yeah, definitely right.
Anyway, as I said, it's not a short comment.
But a great discussion. Okay, so it is break time again. We will come back for our next speaker at 11:30. So please go enjoy the sunshine, but then please come back. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Oh, thanks. Oh, yeah.